occupation of Japan to install an American-led military government in Iraq if the United States topples Saddam Hussein, comma, senior administration officials said today. You know, if you look at the New York Times, count how many times the first paragraph ends with, comma, officials say. New title for the Times and the Post, officials say. Buy it every morning. The plan, New York Times, also calls for war crime trials of Iraqi leaders and a transition to an elected civilian government that could take months or years, no doubt. In the initial phase, Iraq will be governed by an American military commander, perhaps General Tommy R. Franks, commander of US forces in the Persian Gulf, or one of his subordinates, who would assume the role, World War II again, of General Douglas MacArthur, who served in Japan in that role after its surrender in 1945. Well, very good, but you see there's a bit of a problem here. There's no emperor of Iraq, is there? The problem for General Tommy Franks, if he really does turn up in Baghdad to play MacArthur, is that the one unifying sovereign symbol that held Japan together in the ashes of nuclear defeat in 1945 was the Emperor Hirohito, mysteriously absolved of all responsibilities for Japanese atrocities in the Second World War. His military underlings went to the gallows on his behalf. Excuse me a moment, just so I can keep going. But in Iraq, the emperor, of course, is called Saddam Hussein. And if we're to believe the US administration, the Caliph of Tikrit would be in the dock along with the rest of his war criminals. General Franks will have to combine the role of emperor and colonial governor, which is how America's whole imperial adventure might come unstuck. What if the mosques defy the American occupation? What if the Shiites in the south or the Kurds in the north set up their own secret administrations? Are we going to arrest all the imams in the mosques? All those who protest against Western hegemony? You know, it's interesting to note that after the 1991 Gulf War, a large group of Iraqi opposition figures, including many of the secularists, met in Beirut, where I live, and covered the story, in order to plan for a new Iraq, familiar phrase now, fondly, of course, and vainly imagining that Saddam was about to go. But within 24 hours, the Americans liked this meeting very much, they thought this was very positive, but within 24 hours, the opposition, including all those secular men, made an announcement that it would not allow foreign troops to contaminate what it called the sacred banks of the Tigris and Euphrates River, at which point Washington pulled out. There were, of course, at that point American troops in southern Iraq and on the banks of the river, but nothing like what there will be in the future, if what we're told is to be believed. So you see, it just might be, therefore, that the Americans need an emperor. Could it be, for example, that they want to reinstall the kingdom of the Hashemites? Remember, back after the First World War, we, the British, put the Hashemites on the throne of Iraq, courtesy of Winston Churchill, as a compensation prize for being kicked out of Damascus by the French. Could it be that Prince Hassan of Jordan, formerly the Crown Prince until King Hussein had different ideas, might be intended as the new king of Iraq? I'm sure the Iraqis would hope not, and I'm told that he doesn't want to be, but he did turn up oddly, at a meeting of Iraqi opposition leaders in London a few months ago, and also on top of that, when General Franks dropped by in Amman 2 months ago, he did pay a social call on the good prince. I just put these ideas in the air because we're not getting quite that point across to us in the television newspaper stories we hear and read. But if Baghdad is to be our target this year, for the second time in 11 years, I'd like to take you back to the immediate aftermath of the 1991 war in Iraq and to something that many of us journalists fear will happen all over again. I'm going to talk about this briefly and show you some pictures that I've actually shown before in Harvard, but now they've acquired a rather frightening new intensity. In February of 1991, as we know, Saddam's army had been driven out of Kuwait. His soldiers lay, perhaps 10,000 of them, in the deserts of northern Kuwait and southern Iraq. His tanks were burning across hundreds of square miles. Oil fires, some set off by the Iraqis, some by us, turned the sky black. I noticed, going through my files for my notes for this lecture, that I actually have in one of my notebooks splashes of black. It was raining oil as I was taking notes during interviews. Then 7 years later, in March of 1998, on a routine assignment to Baghdad, I noticed something very odd. It started with a chance meeting with a lady called Murtaza Saleh, whom I'd met before. She was wearing a sort of turban hat, and she had cancer. God knows, she told me, maybe the cause is whatever they bombed us with. But she was a chain smoker. Her tragedy seemed a normal one, But then it turned out that her husband, a medical doctor, had died of prostate cancer, and 3 other family members had also died of cancer, some with no history of the disease. I began to ask other Iraqis if they knew of sudden new cancers in their families. An Iraqi official I was chatting to, I've got this thing about officials, one afternoon suddenly said to me, "My neighbour's baby is sick. Her name is Noor Muhammad Yunus. She is only 2.5 years old. She had, it seemed, quote, a sort of shining in her eye. The eye had just been taken out lest the cancer moved to the brain." Then in Basra in southern Iraq, people reported the strangest vegetables. In the region, of course, where we bombed most and attacked much of Iraq's armour during the 1991 conflict. People reported the strangest vegetables in the market: football-sized tomatoes, carrots of a strange purple colour, water that no longer tasted normal. I asked a group of women about the health of their families in the main street. One had a husband with cancer, another an aunt who had just died of cancer. 2 other women interrupted to say their younger sisters had cancer, and so it went on. With 2 colleagues, one American, one British, I travelled down to the border. The last tank battles had been fought here in 1991, not in the desert, as many of us had thought, but in open farmland. There were tomato fields and cows grazing in long grass and small rivers, and among them were the scorched remnants of those Iraqi tanks so pulverized by American A-10 jets 7 years earlier. Then up walked an old farmer, actually a middle-aged farmer, whom I asked quite routinely whether there had been any cancers in his family. And with great sadness he told me his own daughter had just died of cancer. No, he said, there had been no history of cancer in his family. I still cannot remember exactly the first time I heard the phrase depleted uranium. As some of you will know, depleted uranium is a radioactive and chemically toxic nuclear waste. During the process of making fuel for nuclear weapons or power plants, the isotope uranium-235 is separated from uranium. The remaining uranium-238 is called depleted and is now routinely used in the manufacture of an armour-piercing projectile. It's called a depleted uranium penetrator. It is tough and hard, and we used this weapon in the Gulf War, and in Bosnia, and in Kosovo and Serbia. All over the desert, we reporters saw in the aftermath of 1991 Iraqi T-62 and T-72 tanks on fire. They were no match for the modern American and British battle tanks, and one reason was the DU warhead. It goes through the toughest armour. What actually happens is that the DU warhead bursts into flame when it hits its target, releasing as it does so an aerosol spray of uranium. The British Ministry of Defence acknowledges only a very low radiation hazard from this weapon, unless, of course, you happen to be the target or in the area or happen to be breathing in at the time. Some of the thousands of Western soldiers now suffering from what is known as Gulf War syndrome, tens of thousands, not only in Britain but here in America, think differently about this British estimate. So do thousands of Iraqis, including former Iraqi soldiers. An American military document states that, I quote, significant concentrations of DU oxide dust could be expelled from the fire in the event of an explosion after an appreciable amount of DU has been oxidized. Keeping out of the downwind plume or wearing a self-contained breathing apparatus will provide adequate protection. Well, they didn't tell us that at the time. Now back to 1998. After exploring the old battlefields from which the people of Basra obtain their vegetables and animal meat, I visited the hospitals, both in Basra itself and in Baghdad. Now, Tom, I'd like it if you'd be good enough to turn the light down now, because I want to do some slides for you. Now, when I turned up at Dr. Ali's clinic in Basra, that's Dr. Ali on the right, trained in Britain, Edinburgh actually, what I found is that every one of these people, they hadn't got there for me, I just literally walked in, that was my picture, every one of these people had cancer. So what I decided to do was go round the wards of the Children's Hospital, where apparently many of the victims were. I just simply took pictures of all the children who had cancer. Obviously, some of these children would have had cancer anyway, but it did seem a huge amount. I'll just put them up one by one so you can see them. I think they speak for themselves without any commentary from me. In many cases, of course, the families would come and live beside the child. This is the mother and child here. Some children were too weak to talk. This little boy was happy to have his picture taken by the Independent. I don't know if this child knew its picture was being taken. And subsequently, we ran the story very prominently on the front page of the Independent. Now, I'll just go back to the... Please light up. Okay, can I have the lights up again, Tom, please? You see, talking to the parents of these children, there was one common theme. They either came from regions where there'd been massive American bombing, or from those areas around Basra which were contaminated in 1991 by the explosion of DU munitions. In some cases, the children themselves remembered picking up pieces of old ammunition to play with. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you that all the children you've just seen were dead within 6 months. In the months after my first series of articles, readers of my newspaper, The Independent, donated $250,000 for cancer vaccines and medicine for these children. After endless bureaucratic delays, the United Nations said at first we couldn't take the medicines, and when The Independent said we would, we got the permission next day. Though I'd have to say that we had a 3-week delay from Saddam Hussein personally, from his office. We had a big problem with Saddam's regime. You better remember that and think of, what Saddam's regime is like. But we got them in. I actually escorted the truckloads of medicine around the hospitals of Iraq, and the charity CARE did all the work. And again, I took pictures of the children I'd never seen before, this time of children, some of them, who had actually received our medicines. And I'll show them to you now. This is perhaps one of the saddest of all. This little girl could no longer speak. This little girl could speak. Indeed, she went and put her party hat on for her photograph. This girl could talk, but obviously her tumour was so great that she was in great pain. I didn't realise when I took this particular... Excuse me, I'm just dropping the mic off here after the signal again. When I took this particular picture, that the fan in the background makes the child look almost like an angel, doesn't she? Again, other children simply couldn't or wouldn't talk. And again, we gave prominence to the story in our newspaper. Now, I have to tell you once more that within 7 months, all those children were dead. What we had discovered, you see, was an explosion of child cancers, of children born after the Gulf War was over in some cases, but who were now dying and whose death appeared to be intimately linked to the weapons we used in that conflict. Bomb now, die later. Now, you'd think, wouldn't you, that the slightest suspicion of all this, even the most tenuous links between DU and cancer, would capture a few headlines around the world. But no. When I got back to my hotel after another day visiting the children's cancer clinic, the so-called ward of death there, in Baghdad, I asked a colleague in an American news agency if he was interested in following up the story. I have not forgotten his reply. He's a friend of mine. World-weary and propaganda-haunted, he said, "Bob, I'm not writing about Iraqi babies." Some of our readers took a more serious view. They wrote to their MPs and they got replies which were as revealing as they were depressing. I'm going to show you now a message from a letter from Doug Henderson, Armed Forces Minister at the British Ministry of Defence. You'll find this very boring, but not quite that boring. We love to have these crowns on all our military things. It's the last paragraph I'll draw your attention to, and I'll read it for you here. The government is aware of suggestions in the press, particularly by Robert Fisk of The Independent, I get a savaging, of course, that there has been an increase in ill health, including alleged deformities, cancers and birth defects, note the word alleged, ladies and gentlemen, in southern Iraq, which some have attributed to the use of DU-based ammunition by UK and US forces during the 1990-91 Gulf conflict. However, the government, the British government, has not seen any peer-reviewed epidemiological research data on this